James, we'll come to David's talk in just a moment, but I want to ask you about change to begin with. To what extent is change that workplaces are addressing and dealing with at the moment driven by technology, or are there other factors that drive change?
That's a great question. It's, in my experience, driven by a number of things, change in the workplace, by a factor of things which organizations have to do. So it could be regulatory change, for example, or even their technology reaching end of life, and so they have to upgrade. That happens. And certainly there's also change that companies make because they want to. They want to get that competitive edge, introduce better capabilities. So there's a variety of reasons that drive change.
Now, thinking through your work in helping make change easier for people, how does your Christian faith in particular shape the way you try and do that?
Yeah, something I've recognized very quickly as a change manager is that a lot of change isn't about people. A lot of decisions are made at a higher level, strategic level, and they're about business outcomes, customer outcomes potentially, but definitely not about people. I'm not trying to overstate that, but often the impacts are on people, and that's the part of change I really care about. Managing change in such a way it preserves dignity for people, particularly making them involved in the change, helping them to participate in the change. Often because a lot of change feels like it's coming at them and they have no say in that. So a lot of my role is about bringing them along the journey, helping them be part of the decision-making process where possible and feasible, and actually feeling like they can own that, and it's not just happening to them, but happening together with them.
So I guess as much as possible, humanise the process and recognise the human cost of change. Yeah. Let's come to David's talk now and just unpack that a little bit more in terms of your context. A pointed question, how are you tempted by Homo Deus to become like a god in your work? Or perhaps how does your work encourage you to have that sort of mindset, that there are no limitations to what you can do?
It's a really good question because it's something I've been struggling with and continue to struggle with. I find my current work situation and the work situations I've been in recently across several organisations are such that work is kind of like a construction site that never closes down. It's 24/7. My wife pointed out to me, it was quite insightful, that if we were working 200 years ago, our work would be limited by just the rhythms of life. You know, the sun sets, you have to go pack down your tools and go. You can't work anymore, right, in the dark. But because of technology, you can keep working. Because of the complexity of technology implementations and the time pressures, which are increasing, you have to keep working, or feel like you keep working. And a lot of the work, particularly I do, is unresolved. And so I feel like often I've got to keep problem solving things. Even when I'm not in the office in front of my laptop, I feel like I'm still often tempted to be working. Actually, at 6 a.m. this morning, I was working as I was thinking through problems in my head. And I think it's not just me. I think a lot of people feel like that. They're just processing stuff all the time, problems. And certainly that's the nature of technology work, but more broadly knowledge work, isn't it?
If I can just push a little bit further, you mentioned this is something you're personally wrestling with at the moment. Yeah, but perhaps unpack that in any way for us. So what's that wrestle look like? Is there that temptation is perhaps there for you to be limitless and never stop?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the pressures in our work environment almost demand that we become like Homo Deus, or stretch and extend into that. And in my own personal situation, I found that I try to leave work generally at a reasonable hour, but I found that even when I was leaving work at a good hour, I was still working, even when I wasn't working. And that would be at the dining table, much to my wife's chagrin. You know, like in the morning, on the way to work, just processing problems all the time. And I actually found recently that I reached the point, and I wasn't even aware of this, that I just sort of boiled over and I kind of cracked, really. And that was, for me, a big wake-up call. To actually take a step back and see how I'm actually working a lot more than just when I'm physically working. I'm working all the time in my head, and that's not healthy. It's trying to be godlike, and I had to take a step back and continue to process how I actually put firm boundaries on that and stop that.
You mentioned cracking, and I think I think many of us perhaps know that experience where we think we're Homo Deus, and then the point comes where actually it all falls apart, and it's a shock, isn't it? That wow, I thought I was limitless, but I'm learning in a painful way that I'm not. So let's just flip to the other side of that. How do you, I guess, what practices or habits might you have that help you embrace your true humanity with all of its limitations? As David said, that true humanity looks like humility, power, restraint. When everything is telling you to operate in the opposite way to that, how do you practice otherwise?
I really like what David unpacked about being human as embracing our limitations. And certainly as I've reflected on the Bible, one of the key themes I see in terms of being human is embracing weakness. You know, God's power is made perfect through weakness. He loves to operate through weakness, through human limitations, because that's when his power is most magnified, majestic, and most obvious. And I think for me, I'm seeking now, because of recent events, to embrace that weakness in my life a lot more. And for me, what that looks like is probably two things. The first is relying more on God, to see my work and what I'm doing as part of God's agenda, that I'm his workmanship, creating Christ for good works, that I might walk, that he's prepared for me to walk in. And so I seek his strength to operate in those good works, from 9 to 5. So genuinely in doing that, not trying to do that behind his back or beside him, but actually with him, prayerfully. The other thing is also embracing weakness by resting well. Not trying to keep working and problem solving things and feeling like I have to get to a certain point so that the next day I can execute on a particular plan, but actually just resting, and resting on weekends, but also resting outside of work as well, and just putting a stop to that constant noise in our minds, or at least in my mind anyway, that's churning away. So just resting. Yeah.
That's really helpful. Two practical things. The two R's, rely on God and rest. Yeah. One final question, and this is in some ways thinking about the witness that this might have in our workplace. Of course, we want to, as I said, explore this for ourselves. We want to save one another from the pain of cracking, but also the hope and prayer is that as we embrace these limitations of humanity, humility, power, restraint, that might be observed by our colleagues and bear witness to them of the difference that the gospel makes for good. How do you see that happening in your life? Or how do you hope that that might happen as you live this out in front of your colleagues?
I think, again, I probably have two things that come to mind there. And the first is a bit counterintuitive, but along the lines of embracing weakness, there are situations at work that we all face, and myself included, where there are complexities, there are risks, and I don't want to expose myself to this. I don't want to take on this particular piece of work, this scope, or face into this problem or issue, because it will make me weak and expose me to weakness. But as a Christian, if it's the right thing to do and I feel compelled, I will increasingly face into those situations, even though it will make me weak and expose me to weakness. So I think that's one part. And I hope my colleagues see that I am trying to do the right thing, and to, even if it does put me in an uncomfortable situation. I think the other part of it is just being okay with being limited. It means that sometimes I can't stay, in the office with everybody. I can't push ahead with timelines that have been imposed upon me. I have to push back on things. It means that I can't keep up with everyone sometimes. And just being okay with that, because I'm confident in God's plan, God's purposes, his sovereignty, and that what he and how he's using me is sufficient, and it doesn't need to be my way and the outcomes that I want or other people want from me all the time. Yeah.
That's very helpful. I found your first point particularly personally challenging. How often you take on tasks because it's going to make me look good and look strong, but taking on tasks because it's the right thing to do, even if it might expose weakness. It's very helpful. Would you please thank James?